Hi, my name is Dustin Turner, and I serve as the Theology and Training Pastor for Vintage Church. And the reason that I'm here today is to talk to you about community group leader training. And one thing in particular that we're going to be talking about today is what does it look like at Vintage Church to multiply community groups. And if you remember one of our previous sessions, what we talked about was multiplying community group leaders. And so this time, what we're going to be kind of doing is piggybacking off that conversation. We talked about it being kind of 1A and we're moving to 1B, where you can't really talk about multiplying community group leaders without talking about multiplying community groups. They're intricately webbed together. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, multiplying community groups. And here's what I want to remind us about as we talk about this. Why do we do this? Why is it important that we multiply community groups? Well, two reasons. Number one, there's a biblical reason. Jesus in Matthew 28 and throughout the Gospels calls us to something. He calls us to make disciples of all nations. And so we as Vintage Church believe in making disciples, and we do that primarily through gospel multiplication. And so I want to remind you today of what is gospel multiplication. So here you go. Vintage Church is committed to our core values of living the gospel, truth, loving the city, love, and being the church community by multiplying individuals, community groups, and gatherings in New Orleans and beyond. So when Jesus calls us to make disciples, number one, we're going to multiply the gospel, truth, love, and community into individuals. We want them to come to faith in Christ. But then we don't want them to do this Christian life alone. We want them to get in community. And so what we're going to do is send them into a community group to be a part of other believers. But we don't want community groups to stop there. We want community groups to multiply. And sooner or later, you've got almost 100 people gathering together. And they want to worship Jesus together, and so they're multiplying gatherings. So gospel multiplication and the Great Commission, making disciples, is critically important to what it means to multiply community groups. That's why we do what we do. That's why multiplying community groups are so important. So, just as we talked about there being this process, if you remember, assessment, recognition, training, and enlistment for raising up and multiplying future community group leaders, there's also a process that we've tried to put in place, a framework, if you will, for what it means to multiply a community group. And just as that process was uniform for multiplying community group leaders throughout Vintage Church, the same can be said for multiplying community groups. So this process, it's a three-phase process, and this is what I want to share with you. Number one, it's this phase of discovery. Discover. Number two, it's a phase of organizing. We want to organize. And number three, the third phase, is launch. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the next few minutes to talk about the significance of discovering, organizing, and launching, and why they're important for multiplying community groups. So, phase number one, discover. Here's some elements that you want to think about as you're discovering to multiply a community group. This is critically important. I can't say this enough. As a community group leader, you never want to quit emphasizing gospel multiplication. You want to continually recognize the significance and the importance and what God has called Vintage Church to, including your community group, that God has called us to gospel multiplication. Now here's the thing about mission and vision that I've learned as a pastor, that I've learned as a leader. It does not matter. Things like this, things like gospel multiplication, when you're tired of saying it, when you're tired of saying, what is gospel multiplication? Well, Vintage Church is committed to its core values of living the gospel, loving the city, being the church by multiplying individuals, community groups, and gatherings in New Orleans and beyond. When you're tired of telling your community group that, they're just realizing that it's important. That is huge, because what that means is we have to preach and teach gospel multiplication to our church, to our community groups over and over and over again, because we've not succeeded, we've not been effective until it's within that person and they're starting to share gospel multiplication as well. So part of this discovery phase is just realizing that we've got to be teaching gospel multiplication and the significance of it all the time in our community groups. It can't be just a once a month, once a year thing. It's got to be every time. So, continually emphasizing gospel multiplication. Now here's the next thing. And what you're going to find is that some of these things, some of these concepts bleed over from the gospel or multiplying community group leaders. And here's one of them. You're going to, in this discovery phase, you're going to begin to assess the people in your group. Do you have a person in your community group that could be a potential future community group leader? Could they be your apprentice? You need to do that. Like, you can't multiply a community group without multiplying a community group leader. So the first thing is that assess. Then you want to assess the growth of the community group. Is there a need, or is this the time to multiply? And here's some questions that I want you to ask yourself. Number one, is the community group growing? If your community group is 4 or 5 people and it's been like that for a month or two, number one, that should challenge you that you want your community group to grow. You need to add more people, make more disciples. But if it's not quite growing and it's not expanding, if you only have 4 people or you just started your community group a month ago, well, in this discovery phase, it's probably not the right time to multiply a community group. You want to give yourself time. You want to build a group. So, is the community group growing? Number 2, is the host home becoming too small for your community group? And that's really important. Man, we are so thankful at Vintage Church to the people that open their homes up on a weekly basis to let 10, 15, even 20 people come in, eat, open the Bible up, and have community. But the reality of it is some of us have small homes, some of us have apartments, condos, and some of us have big homes. And that's okay. But you've got to be able to assess when a home is getting too small. When you're sitting like this and you can barely move or eat or have a conversation, you've got to begin to think, you've got to begin to discover, assess, is it time to multiply? So, is the community group host home becoming too small? And then the third thing is this: is there a potential community group leader? Do you have someone in your group that could be a future leader? And then understanding that assessment time. What's it going to take for them to be able to actually lead their own community group? That's vitally important. So, in this discover phase, those are elements that you're going to do. The last thing is you're going to recognize this community group leader. And that means you're going to go to that person and say, hey, we're always thinking about multiplication. We're always thinking about multiplying community groups. And they know this because they know gospel multiplication. And so what you're doing in that time is you're assessing them and you're recognizing before them that you could be a potential future community group leader. So you're going to spend that time in discovering. That's phase 1. You're going to make some assessments about any future potential community group leaders, as well as the host home, as well as the group, and begin to kind of create this assessment in your head. Am I ready? Or what's the timeline in which where I can multiply my community group? So, phase number 1, discover. Here's phase number 2, organize. Now this is really important because what you've done is you've began to discover the opportunities, you began to assess and recognize, and so now you're going to begin to organize. You've got to do things prior to multiplying a community group. So here you go. Number 1, this is also part of the recognition. You're going to share with your campus pastor and discipleship director about the potential of you multiplying your community group. And again, what I want you to know is that myself, any campus pastor, and discipleship director are resources for you. We are here for you. And that means if you're having issues with multiplying or you have questions, come to us. But most importantly, we want to be on the same page with you. We want to be on the boat with you, knowing that, hey, we've got a group that has potential in a month, in 2 months, in 3 months, in 6 months, to multiply and become another community group. We want to help you in that process, but we also want to celebrate alongside of you that this is an opportunity, that this is something God is doing, and it's something to be celebrated. So that first part of organizing in phase 2 is just to recognize and to share with your campus pastor and discipleship director. Number two, you're going to share with your community group about the apprentice and the future multiplication. And again, this was a part of the recognition phase in what it means to multiply community group leaders. You want to come before your community group and say, listen, we're a group of 10 people. I'm believing in a month, in 2 months, we're going to be 15 people. And if you look around this room, it's clear that 15 people aren't going to fit in here. Or if they do, it's going to be uncomfortable. We need to begin to think about multiplying because gospel multiplication is so important for Vintage Church. And so you just want to take that time to recognize that, to let your community group leader know, your community group know that. You don't want to come a month before you're about to multiply and say, hey, big surprise, we're getting ready to multiply. And then you shock everybody. You want them to be on the same page with you. You want them to be on your team because you want this to be at the end of celebration. When we talk about multiplying community groups, there's one of two ways that this can be discussed. If you don't share this with your community group, this can feel like a divorce or a separation or a split. And that's not it at all. This is multiplication. We are not dividing, we're just multiplying to make more disciples. And the reality of it is that this doesn't have to be the last time or the only time you see one another. Why can't, as community groups, you guys come together and do things? You do mission projects together, or you go to meals together, you go on dates together. You can be unified yet multiplied. And that's vitally important at this organization, at this phase 2 of organizing. So that's part of it. The third thing in this is training. And we kind of talked about this a lot in our last session, so I don't want to spend as much time on it, but I do want to overlay it a little bit, give you some overview on it, because it's significant to the organizing phase of multiplying a community group. So in training, number one, you're going to provide that consistent one-on-one training. And this is significant not necessarily for the community group, but for the future community group leader, your apprentice. You're going to give them that one-on-one training. You're going to provide them with the CG training that we are doing right now, the CG training that we've done in the past. You're also going to train them on their weaknesses. And this is where you're going to use your campus pastor. You're going to use your discipleship director. You're going to use me to give you resources on training them in a weakness that they have. Second thing is you're going to invite your apprentice to future community group leader meetings where we're talking about the very things that they need to know. What's a community group leader? What's a community group? What's the importance of discipleship? What's the importance of living a balanced, disciplined life? Those are all topics and elements that they need to know as a future community group leader. So, thirdly is this, you're going to provide them opportunities for them to lead the community group times, that they're going to be able to have opportunities to facilitate those discussions, ones with you there and ones without you there. So that training element is vitally and critically important to what it means to begin to organize, to multiply a community group. There's also more though. Because the host homes are so important to our community groups, in this organized phase, it's really important that you begin to look for a future host home. And this might come within your group where someone's potentially has a home that they can host in, or it might be you going outside of a group to someone that's not a part of a community group that has an excellent home to have a new group meet there. So that's really important. I can't stress that enough. Host homes are almost as important as raising up future community group leaders. Basically, without a community group leader and a host home, you can't do a community group. And so those are really important elements. Finally, you're going to gather the core group for the future community group. So what I mean by that is the people that are going to be a part of this new group, you're going to gather those people and let them know, I need you along for this journey. Now, there's one of two ways of doing this. Number one, you can allow them to pick and say, Johnny is going to lead this group, Billy's going to lead this group. Which one do you want to go to? But I don't want you to do that. I don't think that's the right way to begin to organize and multiply community groups. I want you to tap on shoulders. I want you to go to the people in your community group and say, I need you in my community group. I need you to be a part of this. And then I want the other leader to go and say, I need you to be a part of my group. What you're doing there is you're creating buy-in for your future community group. You're letting them know that you're important to this church. You're important to this community group, and I need you in my group. And what you do there, this is really important. I know people don't do this on purpose, but what you're doing is you're avoiding a popularity contest. The nature and the reality of people is that some people are more charismatic than others. And the ones that are charismatic, the ones that have great personalities, they tend to drift towards those people. They're allured and drawn to those people. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But you don't have to be a charismatic personality to be a community group leader. And so you don't want people coming to a community group to be a popularity contest. What you want is people coming to a community group to get in the Word, get on mission, to get to know one another. And so that tapping on of the shoulder, that asking them to be a part of your group, allows you to do that. It creates buy-in. It gives you an opportunity to say why they're important, and then give them an opportunity to be a part of your group. So that is really important as well in this phase 2 of organizing. So you have phase 1, discovery, discovering that those elements, what are the things that I need to assess and recognize to launch a new community group, to multiply a new community group. Number 2, you're beginning to organize. Phase 2 is that organization where what are the things that I need to have in place to be ready to multiply. We're going to move to now phase 3. And phase 3 is this, it's the launch phase, okay? So here are some things. Number 1, this is really important. You've got to plan. If you don't plan, it'll never happen. Select a date to multiply your community group. And the most important thing about this is to do it in advance. Don't say, hey, all of a sudden next week, our community group's going to multiply. That's not good. You want to give your group advance notice that, listen, in a month, we're going to multiply out. And we're going to have 2 groups, and it's going to be an incredible celebration. So you want to select that date in advance. You want to give your group enough advance notice to where they're ready, they're thinking about it, and they're ready to multiply. Number 2 in this launch phase, and this goes along with multiplying community group leaders, you're going to want to enlist that community group leader. So there's going to become a point, a time and place where you're going to put this community group leader up with the rest of your community group, and you're going to say, this person, I've raised this person up, it's time to enlist them as a community group leader. That's really important as well. So, in the last session, we also read Acts 13, 1-3, where Paul and Barnabas were set aside by the church at Antioch for the mission that God had called them to. And those same 3 principles, to be set apart, to pray and commission, and to celebrate, are just as important with launching and multiplying a community group. And so, setting apart, and this is where I would encourage you in this, not just set apart the community group leader, but also set apart that new community group to pray over and commission and send them out. So set them apart, knowing that they're made for a particular work. Number 2, you're going to pray and commission over them. You want to pray and ask God to bless them, to multiply them, and for their group to be an incredible blessing to the neighborhood that they're going to. And that means laying on of hands, spending considerable amount of time praying for them and asking God to bless them. And the last thing is this, and we talked about this in our last session, is celebrate. When you multiply a community group, this is a picture of what it means to make disciples and multiply the gospel in New Orleans. And so you want to celebrate this. This is a celebration. This is what God has called us to. And we want to celebrate that it's happening, that God is moving and God is working, that God is multiplying community group leaders. God is multiplying community groups. And now we get to be a part of that. We get to celebrate what God is doing. So when we talk about this phase 3 of launching, we're selecting that date, we're enlisting the leader, we're setting the leader and the group apart, praying and commissioning over them, and then celebrating. Now here's the last word that I want to share with you guys that is really important. When launching a new community group, the preference should be for the new leader and the new group to stay at the host home where you've been meeting, and the old leader and the older group to launch out. And here's why. What you're doing there is you're creating stability for that new group. You're allowing that new group to be in the same time, same place, and it's creating a stability that they don't have as a new group yet. The old community group leader and the community group, they need less of that stability because they've done this before. and they've been a leader, they've been in this group before, and so you want to launch them out to a new host home. And you allow that new group that stability to grow, and you allow the other group the stability of multiplying to have a new location and just to begin to multiply the gospel again in that area. So, the significance of multiplying community groups. It's a part of gospel multiplication. We do that, number one, phase 1, discover. Phase 2, organize. And phase 3, launch. I want to encourage you guys that if you have any questions that as you're multiplying community groups or community group leaders even, please email me, dustin@vintageunited.tv. Again, I'm here as a resource for you because what I want to see you do is be successful in multiplying community group leaders and multiplying community groups. Because as a church, Vintage Church, God has called us to do that very thing. Thanks for joining me today.